So thanks for joining us. We have a great discussion today with some of our former clients, our staff and colleagues, and also partners that we've worked with and admired their work in the housing space over the past few years. So I'm really excited to hear from them today. And I just wanted to introduce ourselves a little bit and talk about how we'll spend the next hour together. But I'm Sally Guzik. I'm a vice president with Fourth Economy, and we're an economic development consulting firm. And we really specialize in having a strategic, equitable, and resilient approach to how we look at holistic economies and building economic mobility and wealth for all. And so some of our work that we do really centers around doing things from action plans, outdoor and cultural economy strategies, housing studies and analysis, workforce and affordable housing strategy, and also looking at strategy, program design, and evaluation. So we have a really wide range of capabilities. And we're here today because we've been hearing from our clients just the importance of really understanding the constraints and the barriers to creating housing opportunities for individuals and understanding also those workforce conditions too. So I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Chris, who's going to talk a little bit about our equity planning toolkit, and you'll learn a little bit more about our equity and inclusion practice within STEER as well with Liliana today. And then we're going to get started on a panel discussion that we hope to be interactive. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can also pop into the Q&A or use the chat to ask questions overall. And at the end, we'll make sure to share everyone's contact information with you as well. So with that, I'll pass it to Chris.
Thanks, Sally. This is the most active chat I think I've ever seen on a webinar. So thanks all for joining. I wanted to share a bit about our Equitable Community Planning Toolkit, which the link is on your screen, and we can also share that on chat and follow up with it on an email. This toolkit that we've just released in the past month or two is an update of a toolkit that we originally set out and created in 2019 and released in 2020. The updated toolkit is a recognition of how important equity is to our community planning work. A lot of resources have been changed or updated since the initial release of this toolkit. So we wanted to get something that reflected our equity practice out into the world. A couple of things that I wanted to highlight in this toolkit. If you visit this website, you'll see a series of 4 workbooks, each that kind of mirrors our planning process by establishing a baseline, best practices in community engagement, strategy development, talking about specific actions, actors, leveraging strengths of communities, and which activities could be funded and implemented to advance equity within communities. And then the 4th book is around tracking and measuring outcomes. Each workbook includes a list of resources and activities that communities can undertake. We want this to be a dynamic resource. So we see this webinar as an extension of that. We also have domain-specific topics that we'll write about in blogs, webinars, and all kinds of engagement work. So thank you for joining our community of practice with this. Our new toolkit was developed in consultation with our colleagues at STEER, so I'm going to throw it over to Liliana to talk a bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Chris, and welcome everyone to this session today. Thank you also for the invitation to talk about STEER and our equity and inclusion practice. In 2021, Fourth Economy joined STEER with the aim to enable us to deliver a comprehensive approach to our clients, and this webinar is a testament of this approach. About the STEER, some of you may know us already. We are an international consulting firm working on transport infrastructure and cities. And we've been around for more than 40 years and are working on several exciting projects in North America, as well as have several hundreds of people working from India to Santiago de Chile. And more than 1 year ago, we established our equity and inclusion practice, even though we have been doing equity and inclusion work for a very long time through the different areas of our consulting practice. On this practice, we work with our fourth economic colleagues, as we believe it is important, very important, that the link between transport and the creation of equitable and resilient economies is real in our advice. And three main characteristics of our equity and inclusion practice that we are introducing today on this webinar. We provide advice to our clients on a variety of core areas, integrating equity across policies and projects from planning to operations, and the areas where we are acting and supporting our clients. We support and work also our communities, clients, and stakeholders to identify burdens and benefits and act based on them and generate actions to tackle them. And we provide this advice through an international equity and inclusion network, allowing us to be truly intersectional. I've heard we have colleagues from Mexico City joining, and really we have a community of leaders in all the businesses and all the offices where we work, and we are learning from the priorities, the policies, and what is being implemented and tried in our different geographies. If anyone of you is interested in finding out more, please look at our website, get in touch with our fourth economic colleagues, with myself or any of the equity and inclusion leaders in STEER. And with that, I hand over to our panel to start the exciting discussion today, and hoping to learn a lot from that. Thank you so much.
All right, with that, I'm going to pass it to Fatima to get us started in introducing herself today.
Sure, thank you. Like she said, my name is Fatima Ori, and I'm the Director of Field Building and Capacity at the Kelsey. I just have a few notes that I want to cover. Field building is basically a fancy way of saying making as many disability forward advocates as possible. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the design standards, which is a program that I run. And the most important thing about the Kelsey, which is a San Francisco-based nonprofit that pioneers housing solutions that open doors and opportunities for everyone. So one of the reasons why persons with disabilities are facing a crisis with affordable housing is that historically, people with disabilities tend to have a lower incomes and be living in poverty. And whereas all of the available housing stock in the US, only 6% of it is accessible to people with mobility or sensory disabilities. And one of the shining stars of the design standards is the fact that they are cross-disability. So rather than focusing on a diagnosis or a type of disability, we refer to the needs of people with disabilities as access needs. And this just means that we seek to serve a broad and diverse set of needs of people with disabilities. So we focus at the Kelsey on affordability, accessibility, and last but not least, inclusion. And I'll steal a line from an architecture partner that we work with often. His name is Eric Mickerton, and he often says, to have an inclusive product, you need an inclusive process. So we really push the need for diversity from the very beginning, And I will pass it over to my colleague Katie, who will tell you a little bit more about community engagement and the importance of involving community in the developments that you do. Katie?
Thanks, Fatima. Hi, everyone. My name's Katie. I'm the Housing Development Manager at the Kelsey, so get to work alongside Fatima. And really that position is a project manager. And as Fatima said, we focus on community inclusion in our community engagement process. And I'm just going to back up a little bit to talk about our different developments where that community engagement process comes into play. So the Kelsey currently has 2 large multifamily projects under construction in the Bay Area. One in downtown San Jose that started construction about 6 months ago, and one in downtown San Francisco, right across from City Hall, that started construction a week or 2 ago, and we're doing our fancy groundbreaking tomorrow. So very fresh, but both of those developments are 100% affordable, going from 20% AMI, area median income, to 80% AMI. And with that process of getting to the point of construction, we have a very intentional community engagement process, which I am in charge of for our developments outside of the Bay Area. We are based in the Bay Area, but work nationally. Myself personally, I'm in Pittsburgh. We have staff all over the country. So the other projects we're working on outside of California are Birmingham, Alabama. We are co-developing a project there. And I'm doing a technical assistance project in Martha's Vineyard. Those are shorter engagements where we advise on the best way to go forward with accessible, inclusive, and affordable housing in that unique local environment. So just to give you a little brief description of our community engagement process, and then I will pass it along to the next presenter, is we're very intentional about partnering with local organizations, and as we call them, local champions. So as Fatima says, we're not the outsiders parachuting in to solve all the problems. We understand that we do not know it all, and we're not going to be there forever. So we want to really, from the very beginning, be working alongside local folks that have been doing this in their local community much longer. So we have a community advisory board, which is made up of 50% of people that identify as having a disability. And also we have a metric that the community advisory board must meet or exceed the racial diversity of the city, ensuring that we are giving power to folks from the very beginning, which then the community engagement process will influence site selection so that we are not, talking to folks after we've already selected a site, after we're already in your neighborhood. We're talking and giving power to folks from the very beginning to inform that process. I don't want to take up too much time on the intro, so I think that is good, and just knowing we'll go into it more, but the Kelsey is very intentional about our process being replicable so that this work can be done all over the country. And as I said, we've been doing this work in some pretty difficult environments of, some Bay Area, high cost areas. So I will pass it on to the next panelist.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Giroux. I am a Community and Economic Development Officer for WEDA, the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority here in the state of Wisconsin. So we are the state's housing authority. And so we focus primarily on affordable housing, and that can be defined, many different ways. But typically we work in the single family space. We work in the multifamily space by allocating housing tax credits as well as multifamily lending. And then we also do have some economic development, opportunities that we work with local financial institutions on, as well as so many other things. So really our priorities are expanding access to quality, affordable housing, and then of course, driving that economic development and opportunities statewide. I also lead our affordable workforce housing pilot initiative, and that's most of what I'll be discussing today. It's really kind of our rural affordable workforce housing pilot, which kicked off in year 2020. And so just to give some context, a large portion of the state of Wisconsin is considered rural by USDA standards, and over half of the communities in Wisconsin have less than 1,500 residents, and 46 of our 72 counties are considered predominantly rural. So this pilot is really nested in as part of our larger rural initiative, as rural can sometimes be a bit underserved with resources. This includes several other components focusing on rural housing, so both multi and single family. I will talk a little bit later about the different challenges for rural communities when it comes to housing, but in a nutshell, traditional funding models are not always designed with small scale in mind. And so in this pilot, WIDA has partnered with 3 different communities with a goal of creating pilot programs to assist in solving those unique challenges each area is experiencing. Each community collaborated with WIDA and our consulting partners for roughly 9 months, and we used a human-centered design approach with a locally led pilot design team. So worked true community engagement with these communities to help with some of these pilot solutions. So this was a really exciting initiative. It was a new initiative for us to embark upon, and I'm excited to get more into it in the discussion coming up. So thank you.
Hi, folks. I'm Nate Wildfire. I am the CEO of the Missing Middle Housing Fund, which is an Oregon-based nonprofit that works to solve our housing underproduction crisis by connecting innovators across policy, sometimes design, materials, and assembly methods, the labor, the people who actually build housing, and of course, how we fund it and finance it. There's pretty big consequences to not building enough housing in Oregon, and that's true everywhere across the United States, because most of the time the biggest check all of us write each month is our rent or our mortgage. And so not having access to housing that is near economic opportunity can really limit the potential of places, economies, and people. So that's what we do, and I'll talk a lot more about it later. Just want to give a shout out. I saw a few folks on the chat from Oregon, and also my home state of Pennsylvania, especially. I think I saw someone from Ridgeway. Most of my extended family's from St. Mary's. Fun tip that's only relevant to that maybe one person. So it's my job to move this panel along and act as our facilitator. And we want to start by really thinking about what equity and inclusion means to us as panelists, but also to the folks that we work with and serve. One of the ways that we define equity and inclusion is really thinking about how strategic decisions, our daily work, and our structures of power are informed by the experiences of the people from all walks of life. I also like to think that because so much of what we talk about is the built environment and change in our communities, it's really how do the people who live, work, play, worship in our communities drive that change. We often talk about seats at a table, but I'd rather think of them as seats behind the vehicle of change. They're actually doing the steering. They're actually pressing the gas pedal. And so how do we ensure that the folks who make up our communities of all diversities, of all walks of life, are actually moving that change along? A couple common definitions for today. Affordable housing is generally based on income. So when you are cost burdened by your housing, it generally means you're paying more than 30% of your income on your housing. That has huge consequences, of course. And then second, affordable housing, we generally define as between 20%, sometimes up to 80% of area median income. My organization, the Missing Middle Housing Fund, focuses on workforce housing, which we generally define as 60 to 80% of area median income, up to 120% of area median income. So you're seeing these bands, right? And the fact remains, we don't produce enough housing, period, across all incomes, let alone affordable and workforce housing. So those are just a couple common definitions. I want to talk a little bit about just some takeaways for today. We may not get to all of them, but here's our objectives as panelists. Number one, what are the innovative, cool models across the country, given the housing crisis we're in, that we can replicate, that we can scale? What are these models of operational excellence? Number two, what are the innovations in policy? Not just operations and how we build something or how we actually construct it, but how does policy drive how we can improve equity and inclusion in our change across housing? Number three, community engagement. You heard from, I think, all of the panelists, maybe except for me, about how you drive community engagement as a core component of community change. So what does that actually mean? We're hoping we get into that quite a bit. 4, design. You heard from Fatima early on, design really can be exclusionary. And so we're going to get to the bottom of why and how we can do that differently. And then last, sometimes the least sexy topic, but I think given our attendees, you're going to be interested in this. How do we actually create a capital stack, the funding, the fuel to do this community change in housing that focuses and centers equity and inclusion? So those are some of the things we're really hoping to get to, right? The innovative models and operations and how we do it, the innovative models and policy, the community engagement piece, design as a driver of community change, and the funding, the capital stack. So with that, I'd like to move it back to our panel, and we're going to start with Rebecca. Rebecca, you spoke just a bit about your work, particularly your rural focus, but also how every place is unique. And so we really got to consider the character, the people, and the culture of a place before we begin. Let's start there. Oh, you're on mute.
Have to unmute. There we go. We've done enough of these, right? I should know to unmute myself. But yeah, exactly. So our focus really was on those rural communities that are, really struggling with housing. And I'll talk a little bit about why and what some of those challenges we found through the rural pilot that were actually, forcing this housing shortage, but really statewide in Wisconsin and across the nation, we're having a housing shortage, especially in that affordable housing space. And you spoke, Nathan, with some definitions, which we really appreciate. And so just kind of prefacing, our rural workforce housing pilot was really focusing on households that are earning that 60% to 120% income band. Of course, knowing that through this work and through these pilot solutions, that it will also help to serve, incomes maybe a little bit higher than that. And of course, incomes in the workforce that are a little bit lower than that. So really, it was kind of an inclusive approach that can really capture a lot of different households. And so really our goal with the pilot was to work at the local level, because everyone has a housing need, but those needs are a little bit unique and distinct based on the area and based on the community. So what we really wanted to work through was a human-centered design process. So we worked hand in hand with a team of local design team members. And we worked also with some consultants that had experience like Fourth Economy in that human-centered design process to help us through that. But we worked through really 3 phases, researching and engagement, ideation phases, implementation phases. So the hope today is to just convey that this was a true community-based process, which helped us inform us on how we're understanding rural housing disparities and to drive change and innovation at the community level. We knew going into this that there was no silver bullet to solving the housing challenge. And if there was, we'd all be doing it. But what we do know and what we did find out is that through partnerships at the local level and through that local leadership, through bringing several other collaborators to the table, we'll be able to get a grasp on those challenges and better understand the kinds of solutions and tools that can help us to get to a place statewide. And of course, we've heard, replication. That was also a goal too, that it can be replicated statewide and also in other rural parts in the nation where we're moving that needle on the workforce housing challenge.
Thanks. I think I'm going to come back to something in a little bit, but just about the uniqueness and distinctness, because I think that's going to touch all of us here. But I want to move to Fatima first. I sort of teed you up to talk a little bit about design and your work at the Kelsey, but tell us more.
Well, it's worth noting that the design standards aim to equip architects, developers, and designers with kind of a guidebook or a toolkit that goes beyond code to provide a cross-disability set of people with specifying access and inclusion. So, and this set of design standards are over 300 elements. So it's pretty exhaustive, and we go from putting together your team to the site selection all the way to amenities and operations, which is at the very end. And on the note of inclusion, I feel like it's at the Kelsey, we try really hard. Inclusion is all about making people feel comfortable where they are. And so if somebody is a wheelchair user and they arrive to find that there are no ramps or elevators, that is probably not going to make that person feel very welcome or included. And so our goal with the cross-disability access is not only people with disabilities, but we want to make it welcoming and inviting to everyone. I'm sure you guys have heard of the curb cut effect, where curb cuts were first designed really only to aid people in wheelchairs getting from the street onto the sidewalk. But now when you think about it, like parents with strollers, a traveler on their way to the airport, somebody on crutches, curb cuts go to give many different types of people access. And that notion is one that drives all of our work at the Kelsey, where we want to design not just for people with disabilities, but for everyone.
Thanks, Fatima. I love the example of the curb cut, most particularly because I was just with my nieces and nephews, like there's 6 of them and they're all under 5 right now. So it's just a stroller extravaganza. And my parents have mobility challenges. And so it resonates really strongly with me that in creating access has sometimes unforeseen ripple effects, sometimes very foreseen, but has these effects on our communities, right? So Katie, I want to pop over to you quick. Sorry, not quick. We're going to hear from everybody. We got some time. But I want you to connect this piece about access now to also the capital stack and the funding piece.
Sure. Great segue. So yeah, well, first, Fatima talking about inclusion being really part of the Kelsey's culture, I will drop in the chat a link to our Learn Center, which really tries to demystify many things, but including the capital stack. And I came from a background of program management and affordable housing, but not finance. And it's been really great to be on the Kelsey team because learning this skill set, it's very rooted in inclusion and using plain language and things like that. So feel free to call me out if I'm using too many acronyms or words that aren't easily understood. So with, as I mentioned in the intro, the Kelsey has done some pretty amazing things of building these multifamily developments that are 100% affordable. And that was made possible by a very diverse and somewhat complicated capital stack. So a couple things that I would like to talk about, and I'll drop things in the chat as well. One funding mechanism that I've noticed not a lot of folks know about and is not available in all states is Section 811, but it can be in all states. Your state just has to apply when the notice of NOFA, an acronym that's already gotten me, but notice of funding availability, I think I read Fatima's lips, comes out. So Section 811 is really great because it provides capital stack for the development to the Kelsey as a nonprofit developer. So to nonprofit developers to support having tenants that use home and community-based service waivers, HCBS waivers. So encouraging folks with disabilities with a range of support needs being able to live independently. So moving away from that ugly history of segregated, institutionalized settings for some folks with disabilities, really providing funding to allow for folks with those waivers to be living in a integrated setting. So the two projects in the Bay Area have 25% of their units set aside for HCBS waivers. So not only do we benefit by having a diverse tenant mix, we also benefit from helping the capital stack of making the project more feasible by having that funding source. Another policy that not all states have adopted, and Rebecca, you may know a lot about this, it's a LIHTC, or plays into LIHTC funding of income averaging. Not all states allow income averaging. So therefore you may have all of your tenants being at 60% AMI and above, rather than being able to reach that deep affordability of 20% AMI. And that is very important to the Kelsey. And my previous work, I worked with supporting low-income homeowners with significant home repairs. So a lot of seniors and folks with disabilities are solely reliant on Social Security. So often that 20% AMI demographic. So the Kelsey is really intentional about making our capital stack so that we can reach that 20% AMI population. Let me see if I have any other capital stack. Oh, and just like, I think it's a great tool to have sustainable diversity in your tenant mix by your funding mechanism. So thinking about funding or federal funding like HOPWA, housing opportunity for people with AIDS, veteran funding. As I said, Section 811, it's like you're embedding the diversity of tenants within your capital stack. So
Katie, I often think about this sort of resiliency of a housing a building, a project. But the same is true across neighborhoods, across cities, and across markets as well. Economies, communities are more resilient if the capital stack, if the dollars are fueling diversity of housing choices across markets, right? So sometimes that looks like a neighborhood, sometimes that looks like an employer shed, right, where a lot of employers are in. Sometimes that looks like an entire city or region. A lot of my work is statewide. And so it becomes increasingly clear as I continue to do this work that the communities I serve are less resilient, less equitable, and less inclusive if there are not a diversity of housing choice in those places. My work is a lot around innovation and around the cost and the speed of delivering housing, because we don't create enough of it. And so how do we solve that underproduction by looking at the finances, by looking at the labor, by et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more with all of you, but I'd like to kind of recenter for a second and talk about how this lack of housing choice, which is often driven by access, which is often driven by disparities between urban and rural, which is often driven by the capital stack, how you fund it impacts the communities that we are part of. So I run a community choir in Portland, Oregon, which has bakers, barbers, machinists, college professors, entry-level computer programmers, students. It's about every, when you sing, you don't just attract folks with lots of means and less means, it's everyone. And when the pandemic hit, I lost over a course of about a year, half my choir. They didn't die, they just moved away because they couldn't afford to live near this community that literally creates harmony, right? That's what we do. And so my community was really impacted because the housing stock of Portland, Oregon did not promote equity and inclusion in any way at all. Access was severed, right? Because suddenly the cost burden was too high. So I always like to try to recenter us back to that if we can. But I want to go a little bit deeper and talk about what are we missing here in this conversation? What are some of the barriers to filling these gaps in providing better access, better equity in our communities, very intentionally creating inclusion in the work we do. And I might actually, I think I might actually go back to Rebecca, because again, I was just scrolling through who's attending, and we have a lot of rural attendees, quite frankly. So let's start there, and then we'll dig back in.
Yeah, definitely happy to, touch base on the missing and of course the barriers that we see. So, speaking of the rural pilot lens here, that's why we did this, right? Because there's a clear shortage of housing opportunities in rural communities, both rental and both single family homeownership opportunities. And of course, we're taking into account housing that's safe, quality, and accessible for those residents. And of course, there's many contributing factors, as to why, we have this housing shortage, not just in rural communities, but really statewide, nationwide. And generally speaking, the state of Wisconsin, like many other states, just has not built enough housing to keep up with the population growth. Many rural communities in the state also have an older and aging housing stock that was built before the 1980s. Leading to this, construction costs in the past few years since 2020 have significantly increased, leading to that shortage, with single family and multifamily costs to construct and to rehab up around 35%, if not more, which is of course leading to a declining affordability. And like I mentioned before, traditional funding mechanisms, some of those like tax credits that we allocate, those are limited resources. And so there's not enough to fit that demand, and other funding mechanisms don't always work for small scale development. And for rural communities, cash flowing these developments, both single family developments and multifamily developments, is a big challenge. There's lower density, which requires less units. There's lower rents. Sometimes there's lower incomes, and often there's a higher cost of that infrastructure piece for communities because of economies of scale. And so, again, the barriers that we see in this work that we've done, and of course, rural communities have many challenges. So of our 3 communities, using this human-centered design approach, we were really able to look at the challenges and the barriers that are specific to that community. And when I say community, it's a county, it's, two counties together. It's really defined by that pilot team and what they wanted their community to be. So I'm using that term loosely here. But, we've identified several barriers, and several overlap. And then, of course, there's some barriers that were unique to each kind of region. But just to name a few, we see barriers that included that public perception of affordable housing. We've all heard the buzz phrase NIMBYism, not in my backyard, because there's not a lot of that community education to really explain what this housing is, right? And why it's needed and why it's necessary. We've also found challenges and uncovered things like outdated and historic zoning and land use policies and practices, limited tools to finance infrastructure, limited financing and technical resources. So those could include things like less local philanthropy in rural communities, less funding from local budgets, not having a dedicated municipal or county staff that really focuses on housing, and of course, other traditional funding tools that can be limited, as I said before, that are not always conducive to those smaller scale developments.
Rebecca, just a quick hit. A lot of our work is now rural because the demand for rural housing is so high. There's like sometimes many of the smaller towns I serve, which are between 2,000 and 20,000 people, they've built maybe 3 units of housing in the last decade. That's not an exaggeration. And so they have a housing underproduction crisis just as acute as some of the larger cities. So it's a very real thing. And I'm so glad you brought up infrastructure. One of the technology companies we work with is called Alpha Ledger. Just an example. I've got 100 for the folks on the webinar, but Alpha Ledger provides municipal bond financing alternatives for very small scale. So if you are putting in road, sewer, water, fiber to facilitate a smaller housing development in your community, you can in essence create a new class of investors and bypass a lot of Wall Street's usual fees to essentially float bonds and municipal loans at a cheaper rate. So I want to make sure I connect you with them. But I'm going to pivot to Fatima now, because Fatima, you had spoken quite a bit about design standards. I loved your example of the curb cuts, but a lot of times I find that zoning codes, design standards for cities are, quite honestly, they've been exclusionary on purpose for many, many years. This goes to lending as well sometimes. And so these are big systems to change, right? It's painful to sometimes crack apart a zoning code or a design standard for a neighborhood or a city. So how do we do it? Like, how do we overcome that barrier when it's so institutionalized?
Thank you for the question. One of the things that we're trying to do is give architects the language to use with their clients and property owners, just to underscore the fact that this is really a value add. And one thing I will throw out there is accessibility is often the scapegoat for doing nothing. People hear accessibility and they think elevators and widening hallways, it's just gonna cost money. And one of the benefits of the design standards is really giving architects tools that they can use with their clients to talk about the benefit of going beyond code. There are, I won't say every, but it's often that developers will not want to do anything beyond code. Code says go to 10 and they just want to go to 10, but we're over here pushing the Kelsey for them to go beyond what the code dictates that they do. So yeah, really giving language and explaining why creating housing for people with and without disabilities is so important.
Thanks. So, I'm hearing, well, gosh, we've got these institutionalized barriers sometimes, right? We've got these, and they're rooted, they're deeply rooted. Oftentimes it's very intentional based on race. It's very intentional based on income. These are policies or systems of exclusion. But I know, Katie, I don't want to pigeonhole you as the money human on our panel, but one of the tools that we have to actually start to bring down some of those institutionalized barriers is actually trying to bring new dollars, different kinds of dollars to the table to incent either a municipality or a developer or a landowner to do something different. It shouldn't be that big of an ask to create an accessible and affordable housing in a community. So maybe talk to me a little bit about financial barriers and or the financial tools that can help us overcome some of that institutionalized, honestly, prejudice, discrimination, exclusion.
Yeah, let's see. I'm thinking from somewhat small of like an individual unit in some areas, source of income discrimination is permissible. So that would be, you're able to put on your Craigslist ad, no Section 8, no housing choice vouchers. So that creates huge inequity across our country. The Bay Area, that's not allowed. Where I'm at in Pittsburgh, it is allowed. So it's really varied all over. And we see where I'm working in Birmingham, it's allowed source of income discrimination. And that again is affecting the ability to have those deep affordable units. So, the misconception, ignorance about what the rent is that you get for housing choice vouchers. In Martha's Vineyard, I believe it's like nearly $2,000 for a 1 unit for a housing choice voucher. So, they are meeting those expectations of having those vouchers be what is needed to pay rent in these very high income areas. But if you don't have protection against discriminating against voucher holders, that's a lost opportunity. Obviously, the Kelsey developments would never discriminate against housing choice vouchers. So that's one way that we achieve deep affordability. The Kelsey is also a policy advocacy organization. I'm not personally involved with that work, so I don't want to mangle what we're doing, but we have a huge initiative in the Senate and soon to be the House called the Vital Act, which was brought on by Senator Casey in Pennsylvania, that is asking for more incentives for accessible units in LIHTC funded projects. So I will drop that in the chat. So those are some examples of systematic change that we can advocate for.
Thanks, Katie. So we've got questions coming in. So we're going to start to hit some of those. I've already slyly been trying to hit some of those as we've gone through our itinerary here. But we do have one that's really about how do we ensure there's equity when we're focused on the labor, when we're actually focused on the who is doing developments. So there's a limited number of developers, there's a limited number of general contractors, subcontractors, product suppliers across our country. And again, there are some institutional, cultural, geographic barriers to developing that skill set. And if we're serious about increasing housing production across affordable and middle income units, we're going to need to very intentionally grow our pool of doers. And so how do we do that? And how do we ensure that those folks reflect the communities we are serving? And so I'm going to take a quick hit at this and then ask if the panel, we'll see if they put up a hand on this one. But in Oregon, we have some folks in a couple different cities, and please follow up with me after if you want some really specific examples. But some community colleges and some more rural communities realized they had a lot of subcontractors that were great at their jobs. They were doing really well. And sometimes that's because maybe they're a timber town in Oregon. That's pretty common. Or maybe they're near a big manufacturer. And so this economy of subcontractors has developed to take advantage of those big economies of scale. The community college has decided we are going to very purposefully create programs for those subcontractors to become general contractors. We need to essentially grow and upskill our existing ecosystem so that we just frankly have more folks who can both enjoy the upside of all of this boom in housing production, but also so that we can reduce the costs across the board and make it a more affordable community, right? If there's only 4 dudes, and they're usually dudes, doing all of the work in a community, the price just goes up and up and up and up and up unless you can add to that talent pool. And then very intentionally, they are attracting folks with English as a second language into those programs, women who are often excluded or less likely to join the construction trades, and of course, residents of color in their communities. So I'd be happy to get more info about that out. But anybody else want to speak to that about how we intentionally diversify our pipeline of the doers in housing? Okay, great.
Speaking with our work on the rural pilot, I think it was really important for us to have a diverse group of stakeholders from the local level. And we found in our 3 pilot communities, we had individuals from the economic development community. So really looking at housing as not only a pillar of what a household needs, but also as economic development, because housing goes beyond, individuals that need housing opportunities, but it also impacts communities. It can impact, the net population growth of those communities. Employers are struggling to find a workforce. Individuals are not having, proper healthcare institutions there because they can't find the workforce. So I know it doesn't really, touch on, the doers of it, but really looking at housing as that economic development piece to help those communities grow. We can't grow those communities without housing for the residents and the workforce. And so I just think it was really great in our pilots that there was those economic development voices coming to the table to do this work.
Awesome. So I also want to hit this question about, this was a good one, and that I think actually all of us can speak to it. How do you approach the issue of affordable housing or workforce housing in communities that have high ratios of seasonal housing and dropping all year round population? The question asker gave an example of Door County in Wisconsin, which I'm sure Rebecca's familiar with, but I heard Katie also speak to Martha's Vineyard, the Bay Area, and so much of my work is the Oregon coast, which is, Airbnb heaven. So let's, Katie, maybe you can start us off there.
Sure. I'll just talk about a couple tools I've seen in action in Martha's Vineyard, that they are allowed to have deed restrictions that require year-round occupancy up to 150% of the area median income. So being very intentional about the issue they're seeing, that more moderate income folks are not able to stay on the island because unfortunately, renting out your place for 3 months in the summer can get you your entire year's profit of renting to one person. This also ties into the housing choice voucher issue, that folks may be able to find someone that will take their housing choice voucher for 10 months and then won't allow them to stay in the summer. So having the ability to deed restrict year-round occupancy is really essential to also help that housing choice voucher issue.
Katie, quick interruption. That's terrible. I didn't even know people did that. That's terrible.
Indeed. So therefore the housing choice voucher can't get approved, even if somebody's like, I'll make it work. I'll somehow, they call it the island shuffle. I will, find somewhere else to stay over the summer. You can't, obviously the housing authority is not going to approve that plan. And I'll drop in the link. They've had some success with the Martha's Vineyard Housing Bank, which is kind of like an opportunity fund for supporting affordable housing, but it ties into increasing the rate against Airbnb rentals to feed into an affordable housing fund. So those are a couple ideas.
Thanks, Katie. Fatima or Rebecca, did you want to hit that one?
Thank you to whoever brought that question forward. In Door County was actually one of our pilot communities. So we worked directly with Door County, and that's, really one of the challenges that we tend to face in the state of Wisconsin when we're surrounded by the Mississippi River, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan. So we have it on three of our borders. So as you can imagine, very touristy communities in certain months of the year. And so, working with Door County, that was why it's important to really focus on the local level challenges, or Door County's challenges in respect of being more of a tourist destination in some parts of the county versus maybe a central rural Wisconsin community might be very different. And so coming up with creative solutions that can help with that. And then we can't necessarily share all of those solutions as we're still working through this because this is still a new pilot process for us. We're excited that things like preserving single family affordability through potential land trust models. And Door County does have a newer built land trust model, which is great. I know you can find information on their website. And we also have resources of like what the Door County pilot design team did in their work with us on our website as well too. But I think it's definitely important to note because I know there's a lot of areas, and in addition to being more of a tourist community, in the Midwest, we are seeing individuals kind of, I don't know if migrate is the right word, but, come to the Midwest to live for quality of life. And now with the expansion of broadband and this whole virtual work from home that's capable for a lot of people, we are starting to see an influx of people that are living here year round. And so of course that everyone needs housing. So that just contributes to that shortage.
Thanks, Rebecca. I know we wanted to do a quick event or a plug of some of the efforts going on, particularly I think Fatima, you had one of those. So I want to make a little space for that. And then I think Sally is going to close us down.
So quickly, I just want to plug AIA, which stands for American Institute for Architects, I think. We are having a lunchtime event for an industry group called Disability Forward Housers and Designers. So the event will be Friday from 11 to 12:30, and then there's going to be a panel discussion that our CEO, Michaela Connery, is going to sit on, and that's going to be in Moscone Center, which is the convention space in room 313 at 2:00. So I just want to plug that. Sure.
Appreciate it. Sally?
Great. Thank you so much to Nathan for moderating the conversation today. This really came out of our work with WIDA and talking more to Fatima, Nathan, and Katie and all of the things that they've been working on recently. It's been really helpful to kind of hear that collaborative approach, but also like states learning from each other, different types of funding mechanisms and resources. So we will make sure that we provide all of the contact information for the panelists and some of the links that were mentioned in the chat today. I know that we didn't get to all of the questions today, so what we will also do is compile those and give the panelists a chance to answer them and send those back out with our thank you message by the end of this week. There was also, some comments around comprehensive economic development strategies, and that's something that Fourth Economy helps a lot of communities with. So currently, we're doing some county and statewide ones as well. But Mike put that comment in, and it's a great opportunity to his point, like those plans get updated, or they should be updated every 5 years. And we are hearing housing rise to the top because they really should be driven by community engagement efforts. So we're always encouraging, those especially direct service organizations that are working on housing to be a part of those conversations, and hopefully that engagement is happening through the process. But if it's not, that's something that you can look into to see kind of how can you make sure that these topics are being kept top of mind to be included, because the comprehensive economic development strategies do have then the opportunity to be funded for those strategies that are listed within it, and more federal or robust funding mechanisms. So we'll make sure to share all of those resources. Some of these additional questions that are still coming through, we'll make sure that are available. And then we'll follow up with all of you soon. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today as well.
So.
You.